Hi everyone, I'm Dan Jagger. I'm a research scientist from University College London, and my lab is interested in how hearing and balance work, and in certain circumstances like Alport syndrome, why they don't work. What I want to talk to you today in this short presentation is the basics of what is sound and how the ear works, and under these circumstances what causes hearing loss, and then a bit more specific about some research that's occurred on Alport syndrome and hearing in the disease. And I'll leave you with some ideas of things to think about and maybe to discuss later. So what is sound? Well, it's a vibration essentially. Anything that emits a sound is vibrating, and you can see from the animations here that the cymbal of a drum kit in slow-mo is actually wobbling around and causing air molecules which are close by to vibrate, and those air molecules are then being sent towards your ear. And you can see the same kind of effect by glitter, which is dancing on top of the diaphragm of a loudspeaker. And if we look at that speaker in this animation in the lower right here, the air molecules are being sort of moved away from the source of the sound and towards you in these waves. So these are waves of sound that we can hear. And what's really important for humans, obviously communication, for speech and for singing as well, is that our voice box vibrates, and that causes the sound that you can hear right now. So our ear is basically set up to receive these air vibrations and to turn them into a language that our brain can understand, so we can figure out what kind of sound this is, what might be emitting it, where it is, and is it a danger to us, or is it something that we could just sit and enjoy listening to. Our inner ear, where all this kind of happens, sits within the skull. It's this kind of curious shaped object. It looks a little bit like a snail from the garden, and it sits deep within the hardest bone of the body, which is called the temporal bone, and it's the one that sits just behind your ear. You can feel this sort of hard ridge of bone, and so it's buried deep within there. When we think about the ear as a whole, we have to think about the outer ear, which has got the pinna on the side of your head, the ear canal, and the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane, to give it its technical name. The job of the outer ear is to funnel sound into the middle ear, which is an air-filled cavity inside your head. And this has got tiny bones in it. These are the smallest bones in your body, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And they transfer these air vibrations through the middle ear to the inner ear, where all the magic happens. The inner ear houses both the auditory or hearing part, but also the balance organs are housed within the same structure within your inner ear. So they allow us to know whether our head is moving backwards and forwards, left or right, or if we're spinning. And it's often these parts of the inner ear go wrong when you have things like vertigo and you sense that the world is spinning around you. So sometimes there may be a problem within your balance part of your inner ear, as well as a hearing problem. Both parts of the inner ear send information via a nerve to the brain, and so the nerve carries an electrical signal. So it's the job of the inner ear to convert movement or sound vibrations into an electrical code, and I'll go on to explain how that works. The brain receives this information, and it's within split second it needs to make decisions about whether this is a safe situation or something we need to run away from, or it might help us just appreciate how speech is happening, or to listen to music. So in simple terms, how hearing happens: this sound vibration is being transmitted through the middle ear. Here are those tiny bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and they're pushing on a fluid which fills the inner ear. And the sound vibration is then carried through the inner ear via this fluid. If we take the snail-shaped cochlea, as it's called, this organ, and we unroll it into a single tube, it's just easier to think about like that. Along the middle of this tube is this structure called the basilar membrane. Now the basilar membrane is a complex structure, but its job is essentially to vibrate in response to those sound vibrations. So it resonates here in response to a sound coming in. You can see it's moving up and down at rapid pace. And so a sound of a middle frequency, kind of in the middle of, say, my speech, would vibrate in the middle of the cochlea, whereas a high pitch would be at the bottom end here, and a low pitch would be at the top end. This basilar membrane has a different structure as you go through the cochlea, so it has a different resonant pattern. One part of the basilar membrane responds to one particular sound frequency, whereas another one will respond to a completely different sound frequency. And in that way, the ear splits up sound, kind of like a piano keyboard, into different frequencies for a different place. Now, how do we sense the movement of this basilar membrane? Well, there are some specialized cells within the ear, which are called hair cells. The hair cells have this little sensory bit on top of them, which looks like a little hair bundle, which is how the cells get their name. And there are two types of hair cells. The inner hair cells are the primary receptor of this system. They're kind of like the photoreceptors of the retina, and they sense vibrations and they send information via nerves to the brain, and the brain can then make its calculations. The second set of hair cells which are important in the system are the outer hair cells, and you can see they're moving, they're changing shape in response to incoming sounds here. And what they're doing is they're actively putting energy into this system to amplify what's happening at the inner hair cell. This whole system, as I said, is full of fluid. And you imagine that fluid damps out energy, kind of like when you're trying to walk through a swimming pool. It's actually a lot harder than just walking around the edge of the swimming pool where it's just air. So the fluid absorbs lots of energy, and the outer hair cells are basically actively overcoming that watery damping to make sure that everything happens at the inner hair cell with the best possible sensitivity that we can get. So the information from the inner hair cell is then sent via the auditory nerve or the cochlear nerve to the brain, and we have our sound. So what happens when people lose their hearing? Well, one very common problem is that the outer hair cells, which we can see here in this little animation, they're still bouncing away over here. We're progressively losing those outer hair cells. We're all doing this as we age. We're all doing this as we get exposed to loud sounds or particular drugs, things which we just can't control. And in certain genetic conditions like Alport syndrome, for some reason which we don't fully understand yet, the outer hair cells are slowly dying. And this means that we're losing that amplification. So the inner hair cells seem to still be working, and the nerves to the brain still work, so the information still gets through, but we just need a little extra help. And so that's what a hearing aid is doing. So in terms of hearing loss in Alport syndrome, more specifically, I want to tell you about the possible causes and about how it progresses, and then some ideas about what we might do to treat hearing loss now and in the future. And then maybe there are some things for you to consider and discuss in groups about how hearing loss affects you and how it affects your daily life. So if we go back into the scientific literature, here there's a study from 2009. There aren't many studies in the literature on Alport syndrome because it is quite a rare disease. And these scientists and clinicians were interested in what might be underlying the hearing loss in the disease. And what they did is they looked at the audiograms, and some of you may be familiar with these graphs that you get generated when you go to see an audiologist, and it tells you about how your hearing is performing at different frequencies of sound. And what they found is that there's quite a mixed story for their group of patients. They were just looking at 32 patients over a number of years, and they found that about 50% of their patients who were diagnosed with Alport syndrome didn't have any hearing loss at all. So their graph, their audiogram, is at the top here. They only need a small amount of sound to be able to hear at all these different frequencies. So their hearing is pretty good. But then there are three groups of patients outside of those, just under 50%, who have different types of hearing loss, and we can tell that from the shapes of the audiograms. There are some which are the classical. If you read the textbook, you'll hear that people with Alport syndrome have a high frequency hearing loss. You see it here at the high frequencies, 2000, 4000, 8000 hertz, that they get a decreased sensitivity, so they need a louder sound at these higher frequencies to be able to hear. So that's actually only about 12.5% of the whole group. So it's not really that prevalent at all. So it may be that there's more complications than we actually thought. A slightly bigger percentage of the group had this trough-shaped audiogram, which basically means they're not too bad at low frequencies and not too bad at the higher frequencies. They struggle more with the mid-region frequencies, and this is important because these are the frequencies which are important in speech. So they will actually struggle with people with a slightly sort of higher end of the speech frequencies. About 25% of their group had a severe hearing loss, which means that they weren't very good at any frequency. So they need a lot of sound, here measured on this axis. They need a lot of sound to hear any of the low, mid or high frequencies. So just to summarize that, from a small group of patients through a single clinic, it's a mixed story. It's actually quite complicated. So the underlying biology which is causing hearing loss in these patients is going to be different from person to person. That's the message that's coming through. So we need more research to understand what is happening in these patients. We need to think more about how the different modes of inheritance affects people and their hearing loss, and then with specific variants, gene variants within that. And think within the ear, at what point is this hearing loss occurring? Is it just outer hair cells are dying, and why are they dying? We know that this is a disease which is related to proteins in basement membranes, so we need to look harder at what happens in basement membranes in the ear. It hasn't been looked at that much. And so future research might use different model systems, animal models, computer models, whatever it is, to try and get some kind of information as to what might be happening in this situation. In another study, slightly later, in America, we have, actually sorry, this is in Europe, we have a group of patients who have X-linked Alport syndrome, the COL4A5 gene, and they found that 82% of their subjects had hearing loss, even though 98% had renal failure. So it's still a very high percentage of their group have a hearing loss. But what they are doing here is measuring the probability of seeing a problem with either the hearing or the kidney, and looking over their age. And what they find is that the hearing loss here in the dots actually occurs first, and this is something that we observe quite a lot with Alport syndrome patients, is that sometime around maybe 10 or the early teens, you start to notice a hearing loss, and this is before there is any problem with the kidney. So this tells us a few things. It tells us that probably that their hearing loss does not result from the kidney problem. It's not that the kidney is going wrong and then we're seeing an effect on the ear. But we also know that because in some Alport families we have people who have hearing loss, but they don't have any problems with their kidneys throughout their whole lifetime. So it's clear in those people that their kidney problem is not causing the hearing loss, because there isn't a kidney problem in the first place. So we know that in the syndrome we get this early onset of hearing loss, again around 10 or into the teens, and then you need more and more sound amplification to be able to hear things, but at some point the hearing loss stabilizes. It doesn't get worse and worse and worse over your lifetime. It's very rare that we see anybody who has a severe to profound hearing loss, so we never really hear about people needing a cochlear implant. So most people can make do with hearing aids. They're not perfect, and we know that. They're getting better all the time, but most people don't get any additional benefit from thinking about a cochlear implant. So, as I say, most patients who have a hearing loss in the disease, and not all patients have a hearing loss, but those that do can get some benefit from a hearing aid or two. Cochlear implants are rarely, if ever, required, which means that the pathway to the brain, the inner hair cells that we talked about before, and their nerves which are carrying information to the brain, that's fine. It's just the amplification that we're losing. So the hearing aid overcomes this problem. So to treat hearing loss beyond a hearing aid, we don't really know what the problem is. The biology, we've got a fair idea of what's going wrong, but we don't exactly know where, and we don't exactly know why. But if we do find out what that source of the problem is, we'd be in a better place to be able to treat it with things like gene therapy or specific drug treatments. It's an interesting time in research. For the first time in major journals, we're starting to see reports of clinical trials which can treat hearing loss. In a condition called Usher syndrome, in the last year, we've had a series of clinical trials which have been using gene therapy to restore hearing to children who have not had great hearing all their life. So by injecting a better copy of the gene that they are missing, suddenly the hearing comes back. It's early days for those trials. We don't really know how long those therapies are going to last. But what we do know, what's really important for Alport syndrome and similar diseases, is that we've worked through how these treatments can work. We know that they're safe, and we know that if we have a target known, we can actually design a therapy for diseases like Alport syndrome. So it's an exciting time, and hopefully in the next few years we can start to figure out these targets that we need to know, and then we can actually start moving forward with treatments, things like gene therapy or specific drugs. So some final messages about your hearing. Please protect your hearing, particularly those of you who have Alport syndrome and predisposed to hearing loss. Your hearing can be damaged by a lot of things in your normal life. There are some things which you can't do anything about. There are certain clinical drugs, antibiotics, which can damage both your kidney and your ear. Certain chemotherapeutics, as they're called, cancer treating drugs, they will unfortunately damage your hearing. Try and avoid head injuries. They're a major cause of hearing loss. Things which can alter your blood supply, heart disease and diabetes, they've been implicated in making your hearing worse. And there are other genetic conditions which are just within your family. There's nothing much you can do about. As we're getting older, we're all getting a little deafer, and so this will happen anyway, whether you have Alport syndrome or not. But the important thing that I would say to you is that loud and prolonged noise are the biggest cause of hearing loss in everyone, and so just do everything you can to avoid being exposed to this loud and prolonged noise. If you have a job where there is a lot of noise, wear hearing protection. Use what they give you, and if they don't give you any protection, ask for it. If you work in a noisy environment, take time out. When you have a break, if you work in a bar, for instance, and it's always going to be loud, during your break time, get out of that loud environment and just give your ears a bit of a rest. It's the one thing you can do to make your hearing last longer. So that's it. Do contact me if you have any questions. Have a chat amongst yourselves about what you think hearing loss, what effects it has on your life, and how it would be made better if we put a bit more effort into some harder research into this area. And hopefully I'll see you all soon. Thank you.